Hello and welcome to the fourth and final preparatory video for our long-term reading project of James Joyce, Ulysses. The actual reading of Ulysses will start on June 16th, on Bloomsday. But so far we have been doing some preparatory reading. We read at least 4 literary works that Joyce experts recommend to read before reading the Ulysses in order to have a better understanding of the Ulysses itself. So if you're interested in the other preparatory videos, there's a playlist here where you can access all of them. In this video today, we take a look at one of Joyce's earlier works, the novel A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, published in, I think, 1916. And as usual, let's start with an overview of the structure of this video. So in my first chapter, I will take a look at the plot and the themes of the novel. In the second chapter, I will talk a little bit about the structure of the novel, about its chapters, about the main structuring element, the so-called Epiphanies, and some symmetries I discovered. Third chapter, I will talk a little bit about the main character, the protagonist, Stephen Dedalus. Fourth chapter, a little bit about the narrative means I detected in the novel. And chapter 5, I will look at chapter 5 of the novel itself in a bit more detailed way, sort of as an exemplary analysis of the novel. And sixth chapter of this video, I will talk a bit about what are the relations between this novel and the works we have read so far in preparation of Ulysses. And seventh chapter, so what next? How and when and where will this actual long-term reading project of Ulysses start? Okay, let's start right away with the first topic of this video, so the plot and the themes. What is the novel about? So we learn about the main character, Stephen Dedalus, and his upbringing in very modest circumstances in an Irish middle-class family, a family that is on the decline in an economic sense, at least. We learn about his school education in a Jesuit boarding school and later a Jesuit college, his youthful piety, and then the awakening of sexuality and the and critical thinking, and then the torments of conscience due to this conflict, and that which in the end results in his renunciation of and emancipation from the Catholic faith, and his development into a self-determined, free and creative artist who decides to leave Ireland and to go into exile to really continue and complete his development as an independent artist. So the main theme, I think, is the liberation of Stephen Dedalus from three different levels of being confined and being rooted in a certain type of cultural thinking and cultural past. It's the liberation from Christianity in the particular variety of the Irish Catholicism. It's the liberation from Irish nationalism and patriotism, and it's the liberation from his ties to family members and his peer group. So these are the main topics and themes of the novel. Let's talk about chapter number 2 of my video. Let's talk about the structure of this novel, the chapters, the epiphanies and symmetries. So on the one hand, the novel is clearly divided into 5 distinct chapters. However, from the point of view of many Joyce interpreters and Joyce scholars, the much more important structuring element is the so-called epiphanies, which occur throughout these 5 chapters. And so these epiphanies are a series of 12 scenes in total, in which in each of them, Stephen has some sudden inspiration, a realization, or a revelation that and that gradually leads him to the aforementioned liberation from his ideological roots and to the realization of his artist personality, or better, a poet's personality. The term epiphany is certainly somewhat unusual, and it comes from the religious language and describes something like a revelatory experience. However, this term has become more or less established in the Joyce scene, and I believe Joyce used this term himself, and therefore I will stick to it for the purpose of this video. And I will just give a quick run through this 12 epiphanies in order to also outline the chronology of the changes and the maturation of Stephen's character and intellect. So let's take them one after other. The first one is often called the so-called eagle epiphany or eagle scene. It refers to a scene in the first chapter, I think even on one of the first two pages, when there we learn about this somewhat creepy nursery rhyme. It's a prime example of an all-black pedagogy based in fear or based on fear. It's like pull out his pull out his eyes, apologize, apologize. So this is a sort of an oppressive pedagogical approach, really building on the experience of guilt, authority, punishment, and what this does to Stephen, that he retreats into inwardness and also to language as a sort of area that he can find refuge in. And the second chapter, the second epiphany, is the so-called glasses episode, in which Stephen is wrongly suspected and accused of having deliberately destroyed his glasses in order not to be in order not to make his homework or not to study anymore. And then he is physically chastised for it. He is beaten, and so that's the experience of innocence on the one hand, but unjust punishment and authority and physical suffering. And the third epiphany is when Stephen successfully complains about this injustice to the school's principal, and yeah, he is told that he's actually right. So he has been treated in an unjust manner. So that's the experience of self-efficacy and of rehabilitation. The fourth epiphany is the so-called fetus epiphany. So Stephen comes across the word fetus carved into a table in the anatomy theater of Queen's College, where his father used to attend when he had been a medical student, and so this brings him to realize the role and the power of sexuality, and also it's closely linked to shame about his own origin. I think this is reinforced by his father's beer-soaked conversations and bragging immediately afterwards. So, and then we learn about how Stephen's way of thinking and reacting to this. I quote from the text: "Nothing stirred within his soul but a cold and cruel and loveless lust. His childhood was dead or lost, and with it his soul capable of simple joys. He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him, and to exult with her in sin." Epiphany number 5, the theater epiphany. There's a description of the play that is put on stage in the school that Stephen attends, and in this play also Stephen has acted out a role. And so this is a first indication of his fascination with language, with literature, with artistic creation. But above all, it's the experience of a sort of a reversal of reality and its conditions. For Stephen, now the literary work, the fiction put on stage, that is the important thing, the real thing, and the truth, the reality, real life is false, and it's not the real thing, is untrue. Then number 5, a consequence of his sexual awakening is the contact with prostitutes. And so that's a first active encounter and practicing of sexuality. And of course, this brings him in conflict with his conscience and the faith of his upbringing, the faith in this variant of the Jesuit Catholicism. And so epiphany number 7 is closely linked to that. That is the hell sermon. So there's a sort of a religious retreat of the whole school, and there are a couple of sermons about the last 4 things are given. And a key sermon is the one about the torments in hell for the sinners. And so, very much shaken by a religious fear, Stephen repents his sexual transgression and he makes a temporal return to faith. I see a lot of symbolism hidden in this epiphany. So, um, related in this case, related to the number 6. So it's the 6th epiphany, and it's about his sexual sins and how he repents them. And so, in the classical Judeo-Christian European tradition of numerology and symbolism, so 6 is somewhat a number of the devil, of devilish temptation. It's also the number of the 6th commandment: "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and in the Catholic tradition, adultery, this applies to much more than just adultery, for it's applied for any kind of sexual impurity or sexual impermissiveness. And now there's the 7th epiphany, is the hell sermon. And the number 7, usually in the Christian thinking, represents something like the divine order. So 7 days of creation, 7 days of the week, 7 mortal sins. So that this hell sermon is the 7th epiphany makes sense. It's a call to return to the divine order, to the divine of creation, and to the order of the divine commandments. So 2 observations that I would just like to briefly touch on here. First, it would be possible to make a detailed excursus on this theology, how the sinners are tormented in hell, and it would be very interesting also to look deeper into why this very central description of the torments of hell, why this makes such a great impression on Stephen. I think the from the purely rhetorical point of view, this sermon on repentance is very skillfully crafted rhetorically. It depicts the torments of the souls in hell in great detail, with equal focus on the physical pain and on the inner pain and inner torment. And I think the controversial theological point of this example of Jesuit preaching is that the torments of hell are presented here as if their extent had been deliberately optimized by God himself to really maximize the sinner's punishment and suffering. So, so this is the theological framework. But if you read it closely, you get the impression that the torments they read as if there were the most perfidious idea of a maximally sadistic and cruel devil. So, and presenting all this as the deliberate planning of God portrays the Christian God as a monstrously cruel being, which is, to my understanding, a downright perversion of the actual Christian message. And then there's another interesting level that would justify an in-depth analysis. That's the level of intertextuality. I see in this sermon very clear echoes of the masterpiece of the Italian medieval literature of Dante Alighieri's description of hell in his Divine Comedy, where we also find a very sophisticated inner structure of hell with a very detailed system of torture that is ingeniously and individually adapted to the various categories of sinners. And so it would be interesting to look at these texts in parallel. But personally, the subject is a bit too dark for me to expand on this in here on my channel in this video. Okay, let's move on to the 8th epiphany. It's when Stephen repents and is absolved. And again, I see this play with number symbolism here. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the number 8 usually symbolizes divine salvation, new beginnings, rebirth. So, for example, if we look at the Old Testament, so 8 people were saved on Noah's Ark. In the Catholic tradition, there's the Feast of Easter is the so-called octave of Easter. That's 8 days of celebrating the Easter feast. And this is also rooted in the fact that Jesus' resurrection takes place on the day after the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the seventh day. So 7 plus 1, it's on the eighth day, there's Jesus' resurrection. So 8 is the new 1. So it's the new beginning. So, and that makes sense here. So this confession, it's a new start for Stephen with a clean slate, a clean plate. So a restart in a new sinful state. But so this is only temporary. And you learn that the ninth Epiphany, it's the vocation to the priesthood and Stephen's decline. So Stephen is asked, because he looks like a model Catholic student. Is asked if he would like to become a priest, but he, in the end, he refuses, and he deliberately chooses the secular pathway, the secular arts. The 10th Epiphany is the one with the so-called bird girl on the beach. So Stephen is at the sea and at the beach. He sees a girl, and it's not just the girl that is beautiful. The whole scene strikes him as both indescribably beautiful but also strange. And it was strange because also the girl seems to have some bird-like qualities. And yeah, the way he sees this scene and the way he's trying to express his ideas about it in words, this is a realization of his artistic vocation. So he becomes aware of the fact that for him beauty and aesthetics are the highest values, and so he's interested in this synthesis of spirituality and aesthetics. And so interestingly, he sees this bird girl immediately after he had a dreamlike vision of flight, of seeing himself, experiencing himself flying. And this was triggered by thinking about his surname Daedalus. And so the ancient hero Daedalus also prepared wings to fly together with the son Icarus. So in in addition to the artistry, also the orientation towards the ancient hero Daedalus, to this myth, and the bird motive is also prepared here in this epiphany, in the 10th Epiphany. And then the 11th Epiphany is the one about where he develops his aesthetic theory. In conversation with his fellow student Lynch, Stephen develops this aesthetic theory on the basis of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And this is, I think, where the real inner transformation into an artist takes place and also becomes visible. He is now ready to talk about this, to confess more or less that this is his real vocation instead of a religious one. And he recognizes the need to detach himself from all his roots. And that leads to the 12th Epiphany, the so-called Villanelle Epiphany. So the villanelle is a certain type of poem, a very demanding structure of a poem, and Stephen writes a poem in according to this format or template, and being able to master this very challenging, highly sophisticated form of poetry, this gives Stephen the certainty that he is called to be an artist. It is meant to be for him to become an artist. So he chooses the path of the artist, and also he chooses the exile. He decides that he has to leave Ireland in order to really develop his full potential as an independent creative artist. So this is, I think, an important element of the structure to follow the sequence of the 12 epiphanies, that uh, yeah, to see the development of Stephen Daedalus as an artist. And I noticed also some other structural elements. So, and I would like to label these as mirrors, symmetries, and their refractions. Just a few examples. I think at the macro structural level, we have a nice mirror symmetry effect. The novel begins on the very first pages with Stephen's biological father addressing Stephen and talking to him in a toddler-like language. And later on, also other family members join in and address Stephen. And all this talking, what it is about, it's all very normative talk. It's about reference to obedience, to constraints, to rules that have to be obeyed. And then on the other end, the final pages of the novel, or even the final lines, the novel ends with a situation which is reversed at least twofold reversed. Now it is Stephen who speaks to a father figure, but he is not addressing his biological father, but he is addressing his freely selected spiritual mythological father. He's addressing Daedalus when he talks about the you old artificer. So this was an epithet or a code name for Daedalus in antiquity, and the theme is no longer norms, obedience, constraints, coercion, or punishment, but on the contrary, it's about freedom. Freedom to be and freedom to create, and so freedom that suits him. So this is a complete reversal of the opening scene here. And another interesting mirror effect I see in the last part of the 5th chapter, the phase where the narrative situation changes. Now we are in the midst of a diary of Stephen, and if you look at the dates of the diary entry, this takes place more or less, not precisely dated, but more or less at the time of the Christian Easter. And so Easter, it has a very clear meaning. Easter is about the death of the old person, and the resurrection of a new person, and in a religious sense. And for Stephen too, this is a phase of the end of his old personality, of his past, and the rise of a new personality. But again, it's sort of a broken symmetry, because this rise of the new person is not at all in a religious sense, but on the contrary, it's turning away from religion and faith. So in principle, it's a reversal or mirroring of the Easter structure, a rebirth, a turning point, but one that has a parallel to or symmetry to the old conventional one. Okay, let's move on to my chapter number 3 of this video. Some key features or characteristics of the protagonist, of Stephen Dedalus as a main character. I think it's important in order to understand Stephen's transformation. So first we need to understand his initial identity and how closely he is rooted in his family, in his nation, in his religion. And so I think this is described very clearly in the 1st chapter, and not in an abstract theoretical way, but for me this is also reflected in a multifaceted father motive, which will accompany us also again in Ulysses. I think that at the beginning, Stephen being rooted in three different traditions is also reflected by having sort of 3 different father figures, each representing one of the 3 areas that define his Irish Catholic identity, and from each of which he then separates himself in the course of the novel. So the first level is the family level. So we have this biological father, Simon Dedalus, but this father figure has a flaw. This father is a failure, a loser. And then the second level is Irish nationalism. And I see that at some points we could see the Irish politician Parnell as a sort of ambiguous, ambivalent father, political father here. He was an important Irish politician, and at times almost a national hero, strongly supported also by Stephen's biological father. But he also was a hero with flaws, a fallen hero. And interestingly, also his fall, the fall of Parnell, was related to what the church and society at that time considered sexual misconduct. So the very topic that also leads Stephen away from his traditional roots in Christian faith. And then the third level is Catholicism. So, and I think the Father Arnell could be considered as a male father-like figure that represents this level of Stephen's background. And again, there's some weakness and some flaw also associated with this spiritual father. What is his weakness? Father Arnell does not stand up for Stephen when Stephen is unjustly beaten for his broken glasses. I think this is a point, some important point where the relation between Stephen and Father Arnell also gets some cracks. Okay, for me, there's another nice indication of Stephen's initial identity and his self-understanding, his self-image. This is, I think, very nicely and subtly expressed in the ownership note that he has in his geography textbook. And of course, it's in the geography textbook. Geography is the subject that shows us where something is located, where it is rooted, where its origin is. So, and this note, in this ownership note in the in this textbook goes like this: Stephen Dedalus is my name. So that's his rooting in the family. Ireland is my nation. That's the level of Irish nationalism, patriotism. Clongowes is my dwelling place. So that's the name of the school. So that's the being rooted in tradition, education, and his peer group. And heaven, my expectation. So that's clearly his root in Christianity and Catholicism. So that tells us all about the young Dedalus. Stephen Dedalus is his name. Ireland is my nation. Clongowes is my dwelling place, and heaven my expectation. I find it interesting and significant, though, that we learn. So this is a subtle move by Joyce, I think, that Stephen did not write this note of ownership into the school book himself. A classmate did it for him. So I think that's again another hint hidden in the detail that this is not an identity chosen by himself, but it is an identity that is determined by others. Okay, so what else do we learn about Stephen in the novel? Very early on, we encounter signs of his ability to perceive sensory impressions very intensely, to develop whole speculative chains of associations about triggered by single words or by single sensory impressions. He is very prone to falling into daydreams. Um, First example in chapter 1, the color of these sort of diligence cards at school, white, pink, and lavender, and that triggers a whole sequence of thoughts. I mean, one page further on, he becomes aware that each person has a specific way of walking. Every single fellow had a different way of walking. I think it's a quote here. Or again, a few pages later, the scent in the chapel that leads him to a to a place name, and then to the images of small cottages, and then to the fantasy journey of sleeping in such a cottage for a night, and then he even imagines the scent of the peat fire and so on. Oh, then this cute heroic little daydream when he's fantasizing about his own heartbreaking funerals, where all people are weeping about this poor Stephen, and so and this is triggered by him lying in the infirmary of the boarding school with just a minor infection, I think, a cold, I think. All these associations he has when he thinks about Mass and Holy Communion. Um, but he is also a little sensitive boy who can't stand some more marked sensory impressions. For example, at the beginning of chapter 2, there is a scene related to cows, and so we learn that he can't stand their physicality of these cows, their excrement, and even their milk they give. That this is repulsive to him. Chapter 2 is also the point where he becomes aware of his otherness, so to say. So the noise of children at play annoyed him, and their silly voices made him feel even more keenly than he had felt at Clongowes that he was different from others. He did not want to play. He wanted to meet in the real world the unsubstantial image which his soul so constantly beheld. End of quote. Um, Chapter 2 also documents his tendency to melancholy and to retreat in order to enjoy his loneliness. Another quote. But when he had sung his song and withdrawn into a snug corner of the room, he began to taste the joy of his loneliness. End of quote. Or a little later, another quote. He was happy only when he was far from them, beyond their call, alone, or in the company of phantasmal comrades. The first intellectual doubts also arise in chapter 2. I quote, "It was towards the close of his first term in the college, when he was in number 6. All the leisure which his school life left him was passed in the company of subversive writers whose gibes and violence of speech set up a ferment in his brain before they passed out of it into his crude writings. So this is also a good example how Joyce sometimes, again, plays with the symbolic meaning of numbers. I also mentioned in traditional European number symbolism, number six has a specific meaning, and it represents both the human spirit, reason, thinking, consciousness, knowledge, and intelligence, but also the devil, the satanic temptation. And this connection between human intellect and satanic temptation makes a lot of sense, because it is actually the story of the human fall. The fall of man in the Christian and Judeo-Christian tradition consisted in eating from the tree of knowledge, of wanting to be as clever as God. And I think it's probably no coincidence that heretical ideas also exert their first influence on Stephen in this sixth school year, and that he writes then a school essay in which he expresses, albeit unconsciously, some thoughts that are heresy according to the classical Catholic dogma. Doubts are also hinted at a little later when a prayer by Stephen is described. His prayer addressed to God, neither God nor saint. So he holds on to the ritual of prayer, but he begins to lose the addressee of the prayer. And I find this is quite typical or symptomatic of Joyce's two-track approach. On the one hand, holding on to certain traditional forms rooted in Irish Catholicism, and using them for his artistic purposes, but completely changing their inner meaning, sometimes just emptying them of their meaning, and sometimes completely reversing their meaning. Okay, let's move on to my fourth point, narrative means. So one could say also some language games. What I found interesting here is that the language changes throughout the novel and in a very clear direction. We have toddler-like language, nursery rhymes in the first chapter, and then a gradual development through of the novel until we reach a level of language that is adept for very sophisticated philosophical discourse on aesthetics and art theory based on the medieval theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas. And we will see this alteration between completely different linguistic styles much more pronounced in Ulysses. But we see that already in this novel, Joyce starts experimenting with this here. Then we have some sort of collage techniques in which Stephen's thoughts and acoustic impressions of the big city, fragments of sentences and exclamations from passers-by or from classmates immediately follow one another without any narrative glue. So this is a collage technique that had been very modern, very new at the time the novel was published. So I also have the first examples of the stream of consciousness narration. And what also do you think is characteristic of this novel is that we observe carefully composed and crafted central concepts and terms, words that are often characterized by an inner tension and contradiction. I think the most obvious example is the name of the main character himself, Stephen Dedalus. On the one hand, it's Stephen, so Stephanus, the first Christian martyr, and this is not a connection I made up, it's actually explicitly mentioned in the novel, and on the other hand, Daedalus, so the pagan hero of Greek mythology. So I see that Joyce, more often than that, he uses terms that have a clear symbolic or metaphorical function, or even two different metaphorical meanings that we become aware of in a second reading. I will give some examples later when I take a look at chapter 5 in more detail. Okay, fifth point. There's a more detailed analysis of the fifth chapter as an example. I find the opening of the chapter incredibly funny, but also tellingly programmatic. The family orients itself to a defective clock, and so you have to know how wrong the clock is, namely 1 hour and 25 minutes, in order to deduce the correct time. So the family admits its whole framework of the family and all its whole framework of values have fallen out of time. They are sort of defective. Then in this chapter, we increasingly see that the sensual experience of nature often has a clarifying, a calming effect on Stephen. I quote, as he walked down the avenue and felt the grey morning light falling about him through the dripping trees and smelled the strange wild smell of the wet leaves and bark, his soul was loosed of her miseries. And he now lives and thinks entirely in literature as his new frame of reference. He no longer thinks a lot in terms of biblical or theological texts, but in terms of characters, for example, from Gerhard Hauptmann's plays and things like that. And we see an increase in the extent how Joyce plays with the associative and symbolic effects of words, as does Stephen's ability to see words as material for his critical, creative, artistic work. An example is where he starts to develop this rhyme about the ivy winds upon the wall, and then this play with ivory ivy, a play with the similarity of sound, but also with the characteristics of the object described. So the ivy is this firmly adhering, overgrowing plant. So this character of ivy, a plant that cannot be easily detached and removed. I think this could be read as a reference to Stephen's ideological legacy that still clings to him and that he's struggling to remove it from him. But it is precisely this detachment from the ivy of the past that becomes a central theme in the fifth chapter. The detachment process is progressing, and here are a few examples of Joyce's sometimes more, sometimes less hidden references to Stephen's process of detachment from his family and his national and religious background. So, for example, there's this reference to the Thomas More statue in front of Trinity College, and Stephen rejects the, I quote, the droll statue of the national poet of Ireland. He sees More as a kind of a primitive peasant posing as an artist. So here is Stephen is expressing his rejection of what he perceives as provincial Irish nationalism. And and this section also there are a lot of words that are reminiscent of slavery, of an unfree dependency relationship. So these words abound here, like serve, servant, serving, yoke. So it all points to a forced situation, an enforced service relationship, something which is not a free choice by you. And there is also talk like the dark, narrow streets of the poorer Jews, which can be read on the surface level as just describing a certain locality in the town, but it also can be interpreted as a rejection or of the intellectual narrowness of the Judeo-Christian religious tradition and of the economic narrowness. So the economic, the poor economic situation, both key conditions, I think, of Stephen's family background. I find the language particularly symbolic in the scene where Stephen arrives in the lecture hall in the theater a little early for the physics lecture, and there's a priest who tries to light a fire in the fireplace. So, for example, we are told that the priest's cassock or soutane is old, threadbare, and worn. And there are many other small references to sort of wretchedness, poverty, and the fact that the priest represents something worn and outdated. But the fire is not lit with fresh fuel, but with old, something that appears to me to be old candle stubs, so with burnt out lights. And the priest seems to be aware of that yeah, it's mentioned that a little draft of fresh air, so that a fresh breeze from the outside would help to light the fire. So that could also be read in a metaphorical way. And Stephen makes it clear that his own intellectual light comes from the philosophical, does not come from theology anymore, but from the philosophical writings of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And so the lecture hall or the theater for the physics lecture is described as being dark and full of cobwebs. So a gloomy theater under the grey cobweb windows. So this is not a place of the future and of knowledge and of innovation, but it's a place that is muffled in old and dead and dusty traditions. And then there's the rather cheeky question from a fellow student as to whether applied science is also taught here. And a not very subtle criticism of the rather grey and not particularly life-relevant theory that is taught here. So, and this is later taken up again in a slightly modified form when a conversation between Stephen and a fellow student brings up botany as an academic subject of study. And then Stephen counters this with the request, next time you do botanical studies, you'd better bring us some turnips and onions. So in other words, do something applied and useful with your knowledge, not don't use it as a dry academic subject, as an academic gimmick. So first the food, then the botany. So this, to me, that reads like an anticipatory variation of the quote, the famous quote by Bertolt Brecht, first the food and then the morals. So it's here first the food and then academic botany as a subject. Other more playfully used language elements, I think, are, for example, the frequent use of the word yellow in chapter 5, which is mostly used to express depravity. And in the second half of the 5th chapter, also the dew metaphor or a dew symbolism. There's repeated mention of dew or dew drops in contexts that suggest that there is a new beginning, something fresh, something pure, unspoiled, something surprising has happened or is developing. And so it could be read as that, but also as a reference to Stephen's artistic eye for beauty in the unconspicuous detail, and in what others no longer see as um, in its beauty and purity because they take it for granted. And then in the second half of the 5th chapter, there is also repeatedly mentioned that Stephen carries around with him a walking stick made of ash wood. And this is a strongly mythologically charged symbol. In ancient times, the ashen stick or a walking stick was the so-called augur's staff, a mark of fortune tellers who predicted the future mostly from the flight of birds, and this picks up on the bird motif, which appears several times. We have in this epiphany of the girl on the beach that we notice that Stephen saw some bird-like qualities in the girl, and this came after he imagined himself flying like a bird, while after musing about his last name Daedalus, about a person that had been flying like a bird. And also then there's the later observation of the bird flight that is also significant for his poetic imagination in some places. So you can, and flying like a bird is also, I think, it's a metaphor for being free, for being able to go wherever you want and not being confined by the limits created by others. So you can read all this also as Stephen changing from a passive observer, um, this ashen stick, and with the augur at the augur staff. So can you read this as his development from a passive observer to an artistic prophet in this chapter. Right? A small spoiler, we will also encounter this walking stick made of ash wood again in Ulysses as an attribute of Stephen. Last example, I noticed the repeated playful use of terms that have to do with monkeys. Also used, and I think with an ambiguous intent, deliberately playing with the similarity to the term monk. So presumably, I think this is a deliberate mockery of monasticism with this obedience to church dogma and religious rules, and an attitude which Stephen certainly perceived as slavish, not in line with human dignity, and therefore sort of monkish. Okay, so back to the main plot elements in chapter 5. Stephen refuses to be drawn into a nationalist patriotic political initiative, and I think this is symptomatic of his increasing detachment from Ireland and especially from these nationalist ideas. This leads to a very heated discussion with some fellow students in which Stephen makes it very clear, I quote, "This race and this country and this life produced me. But," then the postscript, "I shall express myself as I am." So, and then he vehemently rejects his fellow student Davin's demand, "Try to be one of us." And this culminates in his very provocative sentence, "Ireland is the old sow that eats her farrow." So I think this is very provocative for the Irish nationalists or patriots. So then we learn that Stephen develops his own theory of art, his own aesthetics. There are two interesting aspects to this, which I think we are worth to be analyzed and considered down to the level of the selection of individual words. In his theory of aesthetics, Stephen Dedalus refers to Aristotle and Aristotle's statements on the effect that poetry or drama has on the audience. So, and the terms originally used by Aristotle, in English, they have usually been translated as pity and fear. And Stephen Dedalus now uses these terms, but in a slightly modified form. He uses pity and terror, and then he defines both terms. And it becomes clear, I think, that the change from fear to terror is a very significant and a conscious change. Terror is a much more existence threatening type of fear, of anxiety. And I think this also makes sense in this context because for Stephen, his focus on poetry is it's not just a hobby, it's a really existential question for him. So it's for him, this is a force that shakes the very foundations of his previous existence and his creed. And as a result, it fundamentally changes his his total way of being, his total personality, his whole existence. I find also very interesting the differentiation that he makes, this distinction between static and kinetic impression of art on people. So, according to Stephen, inappropriate or bad art evokes emotions that Stephen defines as kinetic. That is, they're moving towards a goal like desire or loathing. For example, the desire to take possession of this object of art or the desire to destroy it. In contrast, he says that the aesthetic sensations experienced when looking at good art are static in nature. It's just the human mind that enjoys itself or enjoys the piece of art and is uplifted by it without any craving for taking possession of the object or destroying it. So this is an interesting idea. And on the other hand, I see it's an interesting tension here with regards to the title and the structure of a novel itself. Perhaps a contradiction deliberately placed by Joyce. So the title of this novel, A Portrait, this borrows from painting and describes a rather static work of art. But in fact, the novel itself is the description of a very dynamic personality development. So it's a rather kinetic work of art. So perhaps another starting point for further exploration of this topic of the theory of aesthetics and art in um, like how Joyce was seeing art. But let's go back to Stephen Dedalus' theory of art. He then describes the artistic process very metaphorically as follows. So artistic work means creating something new and beautiful from base, earthen, vulgar, compromised material through slow, careful work. So he compares this even to overcoming prison gates and as a very arduous process. I quote, to try slowly and humbly and constantly to express, so to press out again from the gross earth or what it brings forth, from sound and shape and color, which are the prison gates of our soul, an image of the beauty we have come to understand. That is art. So, and I think this also very much reflects Joyce's self-image and his attitude also to, in particular, the English language as his material, which according to him is quite coarse and yes, almost flawed. Um, and because it's not his natural mother tongue, it's not Irish. And in any case, it must first be transformed through an artistic process. So in this sense, his linguistic playfulness and linguistic virtuosity, which were considered very experimental and new and innovative and at the time he wrote this novel, I think this can be seen as his first artistic attempts to overcome these limitations of his raw material, the English language. And so there's this repeated statement in the novel that some terms and idioms have a different meaning in art than in the marketplace. And I think this also fits with this idea that there's a need for the artist to use their language material, but to transform it, to make use it with a different meaning in a new context. And so I mentioned the inadequacy of English as a language. And I think this is specifically in the 5th chapter. There are a couple of references to the inadequacy of the English language, which for Stephen, as an Irishman, does not really seem to be his own language, but something imposed on him. So, and this is also nicely reflected in the sometimes misguided conversation about the words tundish or funnel, the discussion which takes place in the scene where the fire is to be lit in the Felix Theatre. And this is deepened then in Stephen's own etymological research on this word tundish. It's described a little bit later, and when now he learns that the widespread perception of which of these words come from the English language and which one from the Irish language, that this notion is in fact erroneous. And he notices that he had been misled by his preconceptions about the language material. And then I think this funnel and tundish topic is more interesting interesting on more levels. I also see this tundish or funnel as an ambiguous symbol deliberately placed here by Joyce. And on the one hand, and this is the original occasion for the conversation, this funnel or tundish is just an instrument for putting oil into a lamp. So in a figurative sense, to bring light, enlightenment, understanding, and also in the material sense, the lamp as a sort of life for reading or for studying in a not yet electrified world. But also, of course, in the figurative sense of for the light of knowledge itself. On the other hand, however, it can also be seen as a coercive instrument to infiltrate something, to infiltrate the Irish culture by the imposed English language, or sort of a critical reference to a kind of linguistic colonialism. And on the other hand, also as an image of the ideological indoctrination of the pupils by the Jesuit colleges. So this is, I think, an imprint that Stephen consciously wants to turn away from. So to my mind, as a German, immediately comes to my mind the so-called Nuremberg funnel. So I don't know whether this century-old German idiomatic phrase from the 16th century, I think, whether this idiomatic phrase and the pictures are known outside Germany, and whether they had been known to Joyce, I don't know, but I think it would make sense. I find this is a very appropriate image in this context for using funnel or tundish as a symbol of sort of forceful indoctrination that Stephen experienced and that he describes as so characteristic of the Jesuit colleges. So two very, very different, very contrasting possible readings of one and the same symbolic word, funnel or tundish. And this sort of contradictions and contrasts and multi-level meanings deliberately placed, in my opinion, by Joyce can be found more frequently in chapter 5. I will just give a very limited selection of examples in a moment. But first, let's get back to the artistic process and Stephen's understanding of the role of the artist. Stephen compares the artist to the creator God, so he should remain invisible behind or beyond what he has created, and more concerned with the paring of his fingernails than with the fate of his work or its effect on the viewer. And on the one hand, okay, of course, this could be read and understood as hubris and almost blasphemous self-aggrandizement of the part of the artist. On the other hand, it's also has a theological meaning. It's a rejection of a specific popular Christian idea of a creator God who continues to keep a watchful eye on how his creatures behave, or who even intervenes in the course of the world, for example, triggered by prayer. And so this, what Stephen mentions here, is the role of the artist like God, is a clear rejection of this specific version of the image of God in certain branches of the Christian culture. The fact that Stephen, on the one hand, turns away from religion, but on the other hand, continues to use religious, um, um, even explicitly Catholic thought patterns, so and symbols and structures, and making them almost a hallmark of his artistic work. I think this is another one of the contradictions or tensions that we will notice throughout the final chapter of the book. His fellow student Cranley formulates this explicitly. I quote, "It is a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve." End of quote. So I'll come back to this point when we talk about the last diary like part of the novel. Back to the action in the fifth chapter. Let's take a closer look at Stephen's breakthrough as a poet in the 12th Epiphany. Stephen, not a public breakthrough, but in his own eyes, a breakthrough, a confirmation that he really has it in him, is sufficiently gifted to become a poet. Stephen really sees himself as a poet after he has successfully created a so-called villanelle. A villanelle is a highly sophisticated form of poetry with very strict requirements in terms of structure, verse scheme, rhyme scheme, and also so the logical flow of the content of the argument. So there are not many examples of really good villanelles in European poetry, precisely because this form is so complex and challenging. So being able to write something like this is actually something of a poetic accolade. And it is interesting that we are not immediately confronted with the final product, the final villanelle, but we rather experience also the gradual development, the struggle for individual verses or stanzas, until then the finished poem stands before us. And I do not want to interpret and analyze this poem in detail. I just point out a few special features and starting points for analysis. So I think it's obvious that the poem combines erotic imagery with religious symbolism. Like what we have things like languorous look and lavish limb on the one hand, and then we have Eucharistic hymn and chalice. And so I think this reflects Stephen's attempt to develop a new conception of art that integrates both spheres and also reflects his own personal vacillation between the two poles of piety and sensuality, sexuality. So we have a religious form that is repurposed for secular purposes, reflecting Stephen's understanding of the artist as a kind of priest of a secular religion focused on aesthetics. And then we have the ambiguity also of the central phrase of the poem, which is repeated again and again. Are you not weary of the ardent days? And again, this is ambiguous. It can be read as a questioning of both, of exaggerated piety and exaggerated sensuality, sexuality. So, and then we have this contradiction also on a more superficial level, this between the form and the content. On the one hand, we have a masterpiece in one of the most difficult forms of poetry on very lofty themes. On the other hand, there's this poorness of the material. The whole thing is written in pencil on a torn piece of used cardboard. Last point before we come to the diary section, I mentioned at the beginning that looking at the beginning and the end of the novel, it seems to be all about turning away from the biological father and towards the ancient hero Daedalus as a spiritual or mythological father figure. And I think this is nicely supported by a key passage towards the end of the fifth chapter, in which Stephen prepares this turn. This is the paragraph in which he answers Cranley's question about Stephen's biological father with a list of his father's attributes, how he sees him. And this list is is ultimately a thorough reckoning, or rather a dismantling of Simon Daedalus as a father, because it portrays him not as an ideal, but as an unsuitable and failed role model. So, what was my father? A medical student, a Norseman, a teener, an amateur actor, a shouting politician, a small landlord, a small investor, a drinker, a good fellow, a storyteller, someone's secretary, something in a distillery, a tax collector, a bankrupt, and at present, a praiser of his own past. In other words, a loser and a windbag. So there's nothing left of sonly pride in his father, of looking up to a role model or an figure to identify with. He ridicules his father, and he distances himself from him very clearly in this passage. So, and then, as I mentioned, on the final 5 pages of the novel, we have a sudden change in form. We suddenly find ourselves in Stephen's diary. So there has been a lot of speculation why Joyce changes the narrative form here. To me, the most convincing of this idea that this is the point where Stephen clearly decides to shape his own personality and fate. So this is the real birth or rebirth of the ego, of the self, of a person of its own creation, and who is now able to speak about himself in the first person perspective. So this from this point of view, I think this makes sense. And from the dates of these diary entries, we see that this episode that was described here, as previously indicated, is roughly within the Christian Easter period. So this is, so to speak, the time of his outing to his family and society. So, and because he refuses something that was considered to be the religious duty of every good Catholic at this time, namely to partake of Holy Communion during the Easter week. And although no specific year is mentioned in this part of the diary, and the Easter holidays are not explicitly mentioned or named, the reference to Easter is quite clear regardless of the year, due to the period from end of March to mid of April. And because Easter is mentioned several times shortly before this diary section begins. And Easter also makes sense in the logic of the novel, but in the new sense, in the sense inverted by Joyce. Easter as the feast of death and resurrection, of a new beginning, the start of a new life, but in this case, not in the religious sense, but for Stephen, on the contrary, in the secular sense. It marks the death of his old religious personality and his resurrection or new life as a secular artist. So, but one, as Cranley said earlier, whose thinking is characterized and supersaturated with the forms of the very religion he no longer believes in. So, and I think we will also see this in Ulysses, that we will encounter Stephen several times, and we'll see that for Stephen and for Joyce, the Christian Catholic heritage is not completely dead and buried, but it is something that continues to shape his thinking and his writing, even if only as a contrasting background to his own new worldview and his new artistic credo. With that, I would like to end this walk through the 5th chapter and the novel as a whole. And it has also often been pointed out that there's artistic development, and in particular the renunciation of Catholicism and the decision to leave Ireland, that this is highly autobiographical of Joyce, essentially tracing the development that Joyce himself took, and which is also reflected in other of his major works, such as Ulysses. And I think this makes this work also so interesting, because now we can see the development not only of a fictional character, but about the author himself. And that's why I think it was important and helpful to read also a portrait of the artist as a young man before reading Ulysses. So, as well as gaining an insight into the world of thought in which Joyce himself grew up and with which he grappled, we have also already gained an impression of how intensively themes of mythology, philosophy, religion, and aesthetics are woven into his texts. And we have already come a little closer to the writing and to the narrative style of Ulysses by seeing how saturated with meaning and rich in associations even single words in these texts can be. And now we learn a lot about the background of one important figure in Ulysses, this Stephen Dedalus. Okay, now sixth chapter of my video. Finally, as usual in these preparatory videos, a short review. So what is the connection to the works read so far as preparation, and what is the possible connection to Ulysses? So first, relation to the Odyssey and to Ulysses, of course, because in Ulysses we will again meet Stephen Dedalus, and now in a new mythological context, because in Ulysses he represents a figure from the Odyssey. He represents a modern Telemachus who is still in some way searching for his father. So that's the connection to the Odyssey and to Ulysses. More generally, like in the Odyssey, so you have known that for Joyce, the reference to Greek mythology is very important, and we see this also reflected in the name of Stephen Dedalus, in his orientation towards the ancient myth of Dedalus. Then the reference to the Bible. I think, of course, this novel is super saturated with Christianity, as one of Stephen fellow students was the terminology Stephen, one of his fellow students used to describe Stephen's way of thinking. So it's Christianity is everywhere. So many references to the Old and the New Testament. Just a few very superficial examples. I think the symbolism of the numbers taken from the Old and New Testament, that the 12 Epiphanies so reflect the so the central meaning of the figure 12 in the Bible. So we have this 12 sons of Jacob turning into the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples of Jesus becoming the 12 apostles. The central meaning of the number 12 in the Revelation of John, also where there is also in specifically Catholic tradition, the 12 stars that Mary wears on her head in religious representations. Just as a small example, also at the level of words and symbols um, throughout the novel. And then the relation to Shakespeare and to Hamlet. So I didn't notice direct quotes from Hamlet. So there is a strong link via this topic of intellectual introspection and hesitation, a search for truth about the world, questioning the things that you have been told, and a difficult relationship of the protagonist with his own father, and this distancing from the world, and also a complex, sometimes negative relationship with um, between the protagonist and his mother, mainly about moral values. But here again, we have the situation reversed. And in Hamlet is thinking that his mother has bad morals, that he's accusing her of having bad morals, marrying so quickly her brother-in-law. But in Ulysses, it's in the portraits the different way around. Stephen is distancing himself from the Christian morals of his mother. And yeah, we later in Ulysses we learn more about. I think the link to Hamlet, it will be much more pronounced and clear, because there we will learn that Stephen Dedalus has developed a very complex theory about Hamlet, and we will learn about this theory in Ulysses. And yeah, for those who have also read Dubliners, I think it will have become clear now how important typical Irish or typical Dublin local atmosphere, local color is for Joyce. This is a constant factor that we saw in the portrait of the artist, and which will of course also accompany us at every page and every turn in Ulysses, since this novel is exclusively set in Dublin. Okay, so number 7, when, where, and how do we continue? When? So, as originally announced, the long-term reading project of Ulysses will start on Bloomsday. So this is June 16th, and on this day, my videos on the first episode of Ulysses will go online. And how does it start? Yeah, yes, as usual. So it will a video similar to these preparation videos. I will share my reading impressions and interpretation approaches with you, but the analysis will probably a bit more detailed, since I will not talk about a whole book in one video, but only about a section of a few dozen pages at best. And where? Okay, so there's a small change. Contrary to my original announcement, this reading project will take place here on my main channel, Polyglot Reading. My secondary channel, and this channel Thomas Mann project, where currently we have still running the long-term reading project on Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. This will remain a Thomas Mann only channel until further notice. So all other long-term reading projects, including Ulysses, will take place here on my main channel, Polyglot Reading. So, okay, that's it for today. I hope you have enjoyed it. My original plan, I was thinking about also discussing the collection of short stories, Dubliners, here in this video. But in the end, I decided not to do so because this video is already much longer than 1 hour. So I was decided that would be just too much. It would be nice if those of you who have read Dubliners would tell us something about it in the comments. Do you see some parallels or some striking differences between Dubliners and the portrait of the artist as a young man? So that would be very interesting to know from your perspective. And okay, so that's it for today. Hope to see you again on June 16th on Bloomsday for celebrating the first episode of Ulysses. And then have a great reading time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.